Thanksgiving weekend 2000, and the long-standing battle over the Adams Mine dump proposal had come to a head. Toronto City Council was scrambling to close the deal on the billion-dollar Adams Mine garbage contract ahead of the looming November election. But Jack Layton, David Miller, and the team of NDP councillors had slowed the debate to a form of siege warfare. In Northern Ontario, in Kirkland Lake, the road and rail blockade at the Adams Mine was entering its 9th day. And every day, more and more people were coming to the blockade. First Nations, farmers, miners, people from all over Northern Ontario and Quebec. The cookhouse and sleeping quarters had grown into a small tent town, and people were preparing for a potential winter occupation. On the Thursday before Thanksgiving, I received an anonymous call from someone in the local Crown Prosecutor's office. Mike Harris is freaking out, they said. He wants 100 people arrested and held without bail until after Thanksgiving in order to take the pressure off the Toronto Council vote. Well, will the judge grant this injunction, I asked? Not a chance, the person told me. The judge had said that as long as there was no violence on the line, there wasn't a judge in the region who would sign that order. I'd always known we had had widespread support, but this clinched it. On the Friday evening, a large crowd gathered in Tent Town. Joseph Gold held a Jewish prayer service, and then people began to bring out instruments around a large fire near the railway tracks. People were coming in from as far away as Toronto and Thunder Bay. A couple from Florida ventured down the road and decided to spend the evening. It was a festive night. The feeling was electric, and the air seemed remarkably light-hearted. That was until a Toronto Sun reporter took me aside and gave me the heads up that the police were about to move against the blockade. The cops are coming before dawn tomorrow to arrest you guys. You know, he said to me, you guys are the good fight. You have no idea how much damage you've done to the other side. My advice to you is that no matter what happens tomorrow, you have to still be standing here when the voting resumes in Toronto on Tuesday. Well, to hold the line until next Tuesday, that seemed like an impossible task. Night fell on the surrounding bush, but an eerie light appeared just beyond the curve in the road, behind the police lines, where the police cars and vans were lining up for that raid that was to come Thanksgiving Saturday morning. I was standing with my wife watching the police vehicles begin to congregate. My wife was holding our youngest daughter, Lola, who was only 2. And Grand Chief Carol McBride came up to us and said simply, "It's either a really good sign or really a bad sign to see a mother with a baby on a blockade. But either way, we're about to find out." So just before dawn on October 7th, the police set up their own blockade at the entrance to the Adams Mine Road. Any car attempting to come down the barricade site were told to go home, but none of those cars left. They parked along the gravel shoulder of the highway. People began to get out of the cars bringing turkey and ham and pumpkin pie. They began moving around the vast array of police and paddy wagons. The message had gone through the region the night before that the police were coming, and rather than bringing placards or balaclavas, we told people to bring food. Because arrests or no arrests, we were going to celebrate Thanksgiving dinner on the Adams Mine Road. I remember one frazzled police officer who was trying to turn back the vehicles, and he was getting a stern lecture from George Magnitich, who told him, "I am roasting the Thanksgiving pig. If you don't make room for my supplies, I'm not going to be able to get the pig ready in time for the supper." At first light, the police came down in a big phalanx to the railway tracks. We were already lined up on the other side, locked arm in arm. A police officer stepped out and read the injunction ordering us to leave. That's when our chief negotiator, Terry Graves, stepped forward to meet the officer. Graves looked at the injunction and noticed it did not have the official red seal. "Wait a minute. This isn't a legitimate injunction. It came off a bloody fax machine. Where's the original?" Well, the original copy was nowhere to be had because the police officer couldn't find a local judge to sign it. So they'd been forced to rely on a faxed injunction from another jurisdiction. "You can't arrest us with a faxed injunction," Terry Graves said. The officer repeated his ultimatum. Terry Graves turned his back on the police. I refused to be a participant in an illegal act. Now the police were thoroughly confused, and tensions were running very high. Young activists from Timiskaming First Nation began waving the Mohawk warrior flag. The police knew they might be waiting for the better part of a day for an enforceable injunction to arrive. And at this moment, Officer Jim McDonnell, the lead commander for the OPP, stepped forward. Jim was all brass and serious business, and he'd been sent from the North Bay detachment to get this situation under control. MacDonald was a tough cop. I knew him. But I also knew that he and Terry Graves, our chief negotiator, shared a deep love of the music of Fred Eaglesmith. And once I got them to talk about music, that tense moment just seemed to pass. Now, MacDonald had a real problem on his hands. He could easily fill the paddy wagons with Thanksgiving families, but that could lead to a troubling backlash. Throughout the region, there could be many rural or First Nation loners willing to take matters into their own hands. Both sides feared the possibility of a lone actor causing damage or hurt. So MacDonald and Graves agreed on a compromise. The tent city would be moved back 50 feet, and the days of backed-up freight trains allowed to move. The tents, the cookhouses, everything else could stay on the road, so it would leave a de facto occupation of the Adams Mine Road intact while the trains could proceed. And MacDonald barked out the orders to push everything back 50 feet, and our volunteer army sprang into action. We were still holding the line. So as Graves and MacDonald finalized their negotiations, people began pouring down the road with all the supplies needed for the largest Thanksgiving supper the Timiskaming region had ever seen. A large temporary dining hall was built with 2x4s and tarps to provide some protection from the increasingly cold temperatures. The event began with prayers of thanksgiving from the back of a pickup truck. Yellow birch leaves fell from the trees and swirled in the cold air as Rita Stanger sang a haunting a cappella version of Amazing Grace. And then the feeding of over 1,000 people began. In true rural style, the gathered community came together and shared food and fellowship, and the Thanksgiving meal on the Adams Mine Road was the highlight in what had been a month of tension and conflict. And even after 1,000 people had been fed, there were multiple supplies of pumpkin pie and apple pie left over. But as the families were celebrating their continued control of the road, the Blockade leadership realized we'd come to another dead end. The Toronto vote was within 3 days, and we appeared to have run out of tools for maintaining the pressure, because with an injunction against actions on the rail line, our pressure points were now severely limited. We had a serious huddle of the leadership, and Grand Chief McBride listened quietly as people put forward ideas, but none of them seemed to work. And then she said emphatically, "We're going to load up the school buses, and we're going to take this fight to Toronto." There was a flurry of protests as to why this wasn't a good idea, but Chief McBride was resolute. And so on Sunday, Thanksgiving, after church, a short public meeting was held upstairs in the Earlton Arena, and all the leftover food from the Thanksgiving dinner, including hundreds of slices of pumpkin pie, was laid out on the table. And the room quickly filled with hundreds of people. And the OPP stood along the walls of the hall. They seemed relieved that they hadn't had to arrest us, because we'd all developed a good and respectful relationship with each other. And the mood in that hall was energized. And Grand Chief Carol McBride stood up and said simply, "There are school buses outside," she declared. "We are leaving in 1 hour. You go home, get your toothbrush, get your sleeping bag. We're going to take this fight right into the heart of the city of Toronto." And so with no idea where we were going to stay, what was to come next, Northern folks went home, got their toothbrushes and their sleeping bags, and now we were on the road to Toronto for the final showdown, the final defeat of the Adams Mine garbage dump.